to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to be talking about a very interesting concept, global governance, and how it impacts people all around the world. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Professor Margaret Peggy Karns is a senior fellow in the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and is Professor Emerita of Political Science at the University of Dayton. She is the co-author of two very interesting books. One is the International Organizations, the Politics and Processes of Global Governance, and the second is the United Nations in the 21st Century. Professor Karns lived and taught in both China and Vietnam in the 1990s. Professor Margaret Peggy Karns, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks for the invitation to join you.
I appreciate you being with me today. We've got heady topics to get in today to talk about, and they're very important to people all around the world. But let's start with a very basic one. When we hear this term global governance, what exactly does it mean? Just a brief definition of it.
Well, the brief definition is it encompasses the international organizations, the rules, the norms by which countries and peoples and non-governmental groups try to deal with issues and problems in the world today. And so what we see in terms of global governance today is different from global governance a century ago, for example, let alone 2 centuries ago. But and it's more global because obviously we are more connected around the globe, and we've got actors and entities involved that are located in many different parts of the globe. So it's a way of trying to understand how people and countries and groups endeavor to deal with issues and problems that connect them.
Exactly. And there's so many myths out there about internationalization, globalization, the United Nations, global governance, but this is not a one world government. It has nothing to do with it. It's not making people do what they don't want to do. This is trying to deal with the major issues and to deal with them rationally and hopefully effectively. So anyway, I just want to get that on the table to start off with. Well, who are some of the key actors and players when we're talking about the global governance?
Well, obviously states are the core actors and the major powers among them and the various groupings of states. And that's where we start. But then you've got several hundred intergovernmental organizations of which those states are members, some of which are truly global in their scope, some of which are regional in their scope or sub-regional. Some of them are devoted to very specific issues. Others are much more general, the UN being the prime example of an organization that encompasses almost any issue you can imagine on the globe in that regard. But it's also important to include the non-state actors, as we refer to them, some of which are non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International or Doctors Without Borders, but others of which are more like social movements and networks of people in different parts of the world that get involved in dealing with different issues. And whether it's a coalition of groups, for example, that sought to ban anti-personnel landmines or more recently cluster munitions, those are 2 kinds of examples. And then there are the host of groups that deal with humanitarian issues in various kinds of ways and have over time divided up responsibilities among themselves as to who manages housing, who manages schools, who manages water supply, etc. All of which we see coming very much to the fore in humanitarian crises like that in Gaza, like that in Sudan right now, and so on.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned several of the players out there like Amnesty International. We could go across the board, Rotary International, we could talk about the International Rescue Committee, just on across the board. But the one key thing is that all of these organizations, or just about all of them, coordinate and collaborate with the United Nations, which is the epicenter of dealing with these problems. So is that, first off, is that correct? And secondly, what role does the UN play?
Well, yes, in many ways, the UN is an epicenter, and it is where the world comes together. It is the primary place. But the thing I always like to stress about the UN is that it is a complex system of organizations. because within the UN, you have both the major organs like the General Assembly and the Security Council, but you also have specialized agencies like the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Health Organization, United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, and lots of different programs and entities within that complex system. And that's where, you know, when people ask about the significance of the UN today, you know, I would say it's everywhere, because if you think about the whole system, you know, bits and parts of it are all over the place in places you might not necessarily even imagine that there is a UN presence in some way, shape, or form. And you take a situation like that in the Gaza war, and you've got a large number of UN agencies and actors involved in different ways, not necessarily in Gaza, but trying to deal with it. And yet people so often get focused on the two major organs, either the Security Council or the General Assembly, and why aren't they doing more?
Exactly.
And these are two different levels of doing and analysis in some sense, because the tough part of doing in the Security Council is 15 member states, 5 of whom have veto power, and 2 to 3 of whom have been exercising that veto power with some regularity over the years, to block actions that they don't like, either that affect them or directly affect friends and allies of theirs. Whereas the General Assembly is, you know, everybody's there, everybody gets a vote. And so you have a lot more opportunity to try to move something, but less ability necessarily for that movement to have more significance than just a vote on a particular subject matter.
I'm glad you mentioned the breadth, the width and breadth of the United Nations, the family of UN agencies. And that's an example we've often used on this program, that the UN touches our lives every day, that we may not even realize it. If we travel internationally by air or by ship, or we ship something overseas, or send a letter to Tokyo, or watch the evening news with weather news in the evening, whatever, that it's a UN agency that helps move that information and those goods and services worldwide safely and effectively. And we just never hear about these agencies unless there's a problem, unless an airliner crashes or something like that. But I'm glad also that you mentioned about the 2 levels of the UN. And during this horrible, horrific Ukrainian conflict, it's been interesting, but it's also been very frustrating to watch the UN Security Council, which has been partially paralyzed, not completely, but partially.
Right.
Yet you have other parts of the UN, like the UN General Assembly, that tossed Russia off the UN Human Rights Council. You have on the front lines in Ukraine right now, UN agencies, the World Food Program, UN Children's Fund, refugees organizations, just all across the board, that are there, that are functioning very effectively. And you really, when people criticize the UN, they maybe rightly so criticize the Security Council, but there's a lot more of the UN that's really there making a difference in people's lives.
One thing, Bill, that I think is helpful to emphasize for people is you know, if you and I were in a different part of the world, where there was a humanitarian crisis, or there was food shortages, or there had just been a major natural disaster, or it's a developing country with endemic poverty and disease and so on. Everybody there is going to be much more conscious of the UN, because the UN is present, and these various agencies and programs are active there addressing the particular problems. Here in the United States, you know, the UN is in New York, and that's how most Americans perceive it. It's in New York, and we don't see it in our communities. If we have a major natural disaster, the major tornadoes that have been striking parts of the Midwest and the Plains in recent days, well, it's not UN groups that turn up there. It's the American Red Cross, you know, and other groups that turn up there, and that's a huge difference, I think, for American listeners, is that we live in a society that is rich and able to take care of most of its issues and problems, and not dependent upon international organizations to bring in the assistance to help.
That's very true. And so often when you hear the media report what's going on in some of these areas, like in Ukraine, for example, they'd say international aid is being distributed. Well, yeah, by the World Food Program. they never say the UN World Food Program or
Right.
UNICEF or whatever the case might be. But we're going to talk about these in greater detail when we come back after this mid-show ID. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a podcast or a computer, you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at a very important concept, and that's global governance, and one of the key players of that particular concept, the United Nations. My guest is an expert on this topic. Dr. Margaret Peggy Karns is a senior fellow in the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Dr. Karns has co-authored two very important books on this topic. Peggy, let's jump right into it. What do you see as something? We've talked about Ukraine. That's a total disaster, an unmitigated disaster. Talked about the various roles of the UN. What do you see as some of the other major problems out there that the UN is dealing with, and all these other players too? And it's not just them dealing with it, it's really all of us. We should be dealing with climate change,
Collectively, yes,
or refugees, or whatever the case
yes.
might be. What do you see as some of the major issues right now?
Well, let me phrase it slightly differently in terms of what I think some of the major challenges to global governance are, and to dealing with these different issues and problems. And they are challenges for the UN specifically, certainly. And one is, of course, the existential problem of climate change that we face in this day and age, that is fundamentally changing climatic patterns and issues of food supply, and so many other things about the world around us. Human beings have never been very good at thinking about and dealing in the short term with a problem whose major impacts are going to be way out there some point in time. And this is one of the reasons why climate change challenges us to great extent, because it demands that we think now about things that will affect lives 20, 30, 50, 70 or more years down the road. But one of the things I think that is a more immediate and very significant change that we are seeing right now is the return, as many of my colleagues in international relations would put it, of great power competition. Many of us lived through the Cold War. It ended in the early 1990s. We all cheered royally. The world is a very different place, and this is the context in which the concept of global governance really emerged and found usefulness as a way of thinking about dealing with a world that was no longer divided between East and West, the Soviet Union and its friends and allies, and the United States and its friends and allies. But now it's a three-way competition, and potentially a four-way competition with India, China being the third, India being the fourth, all nuclear powers. And at this point, it's looking like we're seeing much more effort actually put into nuclear weapons development and more advances with fewer and fewer constraints on those. So that's one of the challenges for thinking about dealing with issues in the world today, is if you've got major power competition among three major powers and potentially four, much, much harder to get agreement and consensus on what to do, much more competition between and among them and their various interests. And I would just add briefly to that point. There's a lot of talk about a kind of quasi-alliance of authoritarian countries and authoritarian leaders, of which, of course, China, India, and Russia are three. And you can add North Korea, and you can add Iran, and then depending on who else you want to add to the list. But and hence seeing, as President Biden has often put it, more of a divide between authoritarian countries and democratic countries, not the same as the old divide between communism and the free world, or our liberal democratic countries, but still new tensions, unlike those that we've been dealing with in the last 25, 30 years.
Certainly is. Well, as I recall reading someplace, there were like 70 countries, democracies, that were having elections this year. And many of them, including our own, to be quite honest, here in the United States, really are under the gun as far as the possibility of some authoritarian actually winning that election. So this is a major problem. It's not just 3 or 4 countries. This is worldwide. But when you look at this, you see, as I look at it anyway, I see, and I'm not a scholar in this area by any means, but I see a decentralization, this almost an isolationist attitude that's taking over. It's, let's worry about ourselves, don't worry about the rest of the world. We'll take care of ourselves, they can take care of themselves. These were some of the same attitudes that existed prior to World War I. And we saw what happened in World War I, and then we saw it again in World War II. That does not work. Those attitudes, you cannot block yourself off from the rest of the world. You've got to, as I see it, how do you see it?
Well, I mean, it's certainly the nature of those attitudes that's particularly true here in the United States. That's not a phenomenon you tend to find elsewhere. And it's partly because we have had the luxury for much of our history. We are, first of all, a continental country, and we've had the luxury of having peaceful, friendly neighbors, relatively weak on both northern and southern borders. That put us in a somewhat unique position compared to others that had faced wars and invasions and various other threats over their history. And yes, it is extremely worrisome, I think, for many of us to feel like there's a return to the voices of pull back, be more narrow in the kinds of things, how we draw our interests internationally and what we undertake internationally. And that's a long-standing tension, one might say, in American politics that largely disappeared, but not exclusively, from the late 50s until the late 1990s, but has definitely reasserted itself in some ways.
It certainly has.
You mentioned
Yes,
earlier,
please.
and I think maybe you'd like me to come back to the question of Ukraine.
Sure.
There.
Yes.
And one of the things that I would say we're also seeing as a major challenge for global governance, the war in Ukraine is clearly one, and clearly the Gaza war is another, in which we have, 2 significant wars going on simultaneously, both of which have the potential for major ripple effects in the regions in which they're taking place. I mean, the increasing concerns of the Europeans about Russia's intentions are evidence of that in the case of Ukraine. And the concerns we've been hearing since fairly early on in the Gaza situation, in terms of concerns about that conflict becoming more region-wide, drawing in Iran, the attacks across the Syrian frontier, the exchanges between Israel and Iran, and so on and so forth. And I think there are a couple of things that are perhaps worth mentioning in connection with both of these. We've seen major violations of particularly international humanitarian, international criminal law in both of them. And both have included significant humanitarian crises, human rights violations. So, where does this take us? In both cases, we're seeing major efforts made to document human rights abuses, potential for cases through the International Criminal Court to deal with these. There hasn't been so much of a charge in recent months of genocide in respect to Ukraine, but certainly that charge is being raised. And of course, the South Africans initiated a case at the International Court of Justice back in the winter against Israel for the potential for genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. And so in some sense, one of the challenges where I'm going with this to global governance is that some of the things that one might say have been built up over many years in terms of trying to do a better job of dealing with major human rights abuses and advancing international criminal law as a unique and workable framework for dealing with certain kinds of human rights abuses are really challenged in these situations. And the war that's getting forgotten is, of course, the one going on in Sudan, and particularly in the Darfur region, where there was a borderline genocide taking place some almost 20 years ago. And now again, what little comes out from that region suggests major problems. And so this leaves us wondering, this so-called rules-based order, how much order, how much rule abiding is there really in the world? Have we really made any significant progress? Is a very reasonable question to be asking.
It certainly is, and we have to ask it and answer it at the same time. I'm thinking, as I think back over the years, we had a lot more information out there about these issues and about the United Nations. And I know that many years ago, there were courses in schools about the UN, about international issues, but those seem to, well, they've dropped them, to be quite honest. How important is it that the media and the educational system focus on these issues and help us to better understand them?
From a standpoint of educating Americans, I think it's critical. And my own perception is that, education on the UN here in the United States still stays pretty strong in both high schools and colleges. Model United Nations activities are still very popular, and certainly great ways to educate young people in issues and problems in the world, and to build some faith in the UN system in that regard.
Mm. I think you're right. I think the students understand it. I just wish the politicians in Washington understood it, because they do not. I've dealt with them now for 40 years, and the vast majority do not understand it. Well, Peggy, we're down to our last 30 seconds. What type of message would you like to leave with the people around the world as to this particular topic and the importance of it?
Well, I think one thing I would say is don't lose faith in humanity and in people's ability and countries' ability and diplomats' ability to try to stitch together rules and to try to make them stick, to try to hold countries and leaders accountable in some situations. It's never going to be perfect, but it's certainly worth the effort because the alternative is pretty grim.
The alternative could be the end. Is exactly right. And as Madeleine Albright said years ago, that the United Nations was not a perfect organization, but it is indispensable. It's often said, if the UN disappeared today, we would have to recreate it tomorrow. Somebody else has to help move aircraft, ships, mail, weather information around the world, deal with these problems, deal with the climate crisis. And it's the UN. It falls to the UN and to other players too, not just the UN. But
Can I add a little footnote in there?
Yes, please,
Madeleine. One of the topics that's gotten me intrigued in the last few years is the subject of women playing increasing roles as leaders in global governance. In some cases, of course, as leaders of states, or as Madeleine's case, both Secretary of State and our United States permanent representative to the United Nations.
Right.
And of course, one could ask, well, would the world be better if women ran it? Well, I'm not going to engage that issue, but one of the interesting things is the degree to which we're seeing more and more women in key roles And to take the Security Council as one example, two things we're seeing in recent years that I think are intriguing. One is more women as their primary ambassador to the UN, and if their country's on the Security Council, sitting on the Security Council. And in a number of cases, those have been small states, including small island states like St. Vincent and the Grenadines, whose female permanent representative currently is sitting on the Security Council and chairing it this month.
Yes, that's very true. And
yeah.
I'm a firm supporter of having more women involved in the policy-making, decision-making processes. And you're right, we've seen it in Rwanda, we've seen it in Liberia, and in many other countries around the world.
Exactly.
But Dr. Peggy Karns, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Well, thank you, Bill, for the opportunity to talk with you.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.